Okay, guys, so we have spent the last 2 days, minus Shir Klali Day, so last two Shirim, on the question of reallocation of resources. And we have mostly avoided actually getting bogged down in the sugyas in Erchen and in Shkalim, and a focus on the local question here, which is the sugya here equivalent to those sugyot or not? Meaning, when our Gemara, which has been discussing taxation and communal responsibilities and the like, discusses mutar l'shanot, that you're allowed to reallocate resources, is that in some way indicative of what you're supposed to do with tzedakah, or is that unique to our sugya, to these communal social welfare taxes, rather than what we would call charity? And we saw that, to recap, the position for Rabbeinu Tam is you can reallocate as you wish, even l'dvar rashut, right? Even to something which is security, infrastructure, whatever the case, you can take charitable funds and move it to there. And the reason that Rabbeinu Tam, I suggest, believes that is because he views this whole sugya as budgetary concerns in a community, and therefore, yeah, you can reallocate social welfare to infrastructure if that's what you need. And I argue that the Ran says the same thing, because the Ran had argued that the reason you're allowed to reallocate is because it's like a halva'ah, not actually a loan, but the reason is because if the poor people need money, who are they going back to, right? And yeah, we had a fruitful discussion on Monday whether it's dafka a government or it just needs to be an umbrella organization where you can trust that they have a large enough budget that they're going to reallocate. And then we dealt with the hypothetical of a Bernie to Margaret Thatcher government and what that would look like in halacha. Yes. Right, or something that has a budget. Yeah, we talked about different variations in it. We noted that the position of the Rimigash is you can only change it to a mitzvah, and he equates it with the sugya in Erchen and Shkalem, because he seems to think that this is about tzedakah, and especially local donations. The poor people actually own it. We noted that the Rush distinguishes between our case and a case where you did a special GoFundMe campaign for a particular poor person, in which case the money goes to them. And then we noted the Rush himself seems to think the issue is about das, right? What were the intentions of people? And then we saw the Ramban's position that this is actually a loan, right? It's a loan against the budget that you actually have to pay back. And those were the positions that we saw and spent plenty of time exploring. The last sheet I had given you here was the Chidushay Anshe Shem, which it's a miracle, I will be honest, that I don't wear glasses, considering how much I read sources that are the size of that Chidushay Anshe Shem. The only time in my life I needed glasses, right after I left yeshiva, and I got like my eyes had been 20/20 until then, like my eyes weakened slightly, and I got like very, very weak glasses, like 20/30. And then as I got a computer and stopped looking at the little things and would blow them up more on my computer or whatever it was, my eyesight went back to its normal. So, of course, that was when I renewed my license. So it said I had glasses, but then by the time I got a Canadian and Israeli license, they took off the glasses. But it is a miracle with sources the size of that Chidushay Anshe Shem. I'm hoping to go as long as I can without glasses. This is my goal. What? Yeah, maybe that's what it is. It's exercising my eyes. I don't know. I keep praying. I keep my father's genes. My father got glasses when he was like, late 40s, 50. Before then, it is much more convenient to read sources if I don't have to worry about where my glasses are. So, first of all, who is the Chidushay Anshe Shem? No one even bothered looking. You knew I was going to ask, and you didn't bother looking. What? Spend too much time trying to find where it is. Okay, touche. Fine. So, if you look at the beginning the Rif usually, or the beginning of the Gemara, they'll usually have the names for you. Do they here? At the beginning, I think in the Oz V'Hadar they do, right? The beginning of the Rif. If you turn to the first page of the Rif in the Oz V'Hadar, they should have they usually, there you go, right? So they usually have a list of everybody's names. So who is the Chedush Anshe Shem? Ah, very good. Shlomo Kluger. Who is Shlomo Kluger? Very good. He's the Maggid of Brody. Thank you, Ezra. What? Good. How many books did he write? Much more than 2. Thank you. He died at like the age of 50 or something, 52 or something, and he wrote, 165 books in his life. He was a very impressive person. But he also is, yes, there's actually a list. He wrote, I once looked this up. Yeah. Is that what it is, Ezra? 165 books, and he died at what, 52 or something? Oh, okay. I thought he died young. Okay. Even if he died in his 80s, still 106. No matter how you cut it, 165 books in your life is very impressive. He's a very interesting thinker. Very, 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 very creative. Often some of the weirdest positions you will find on a sugya are in Rav Shlomo Kluger. What? Anyways, but he was known as a super genius, because he wrote 165 books, and they're not like 5-page books. These are like very significant works. Like he has a Perush on Shulchan Aruch. He has a book just on like Hilchos Pikuach Nefesh. He has a book just on Nazirus. He has a lot of very interesting books. Anyways, so Chedush Anshe Shem has an interesting piece here in font 0.5. At least I already have a small Gemara, so this is like, okay, he writes, V'lav dafka sheyitnu b'tchilat hashinui al menat halva. So first of all, he says, we don't just mean that you're borrowing against the budget, right? That it's a loan. Meaning, who is he rejecting? The Ramban, right? Meaning this is not a loan. That's not what we're talking about. That's the Ramban's position. This is a loan against the budget. Afilu lo yifra'u owed. Even if he's not going to pay it back, kevan shetzibor yachol lishanot afilu l'dvar reshut. Even though they're not going to pay it back, since it is a community, they can reallocate the resources even for optional things. V'hagabai she'eno tzibor davka l'dvar mitzvah. But he says, if it's not the community making the decision, but it's the tzedakah collector, so he has less options. He can reallocate, but only to other mitzvah purposes. V'hayachid shenadar tzedakah v'efrisha ad shlobat liyanagabai mudlashan afilu dvar reshut. A yachid who sets aside tzedakah but hasn't yet given it to the gabbai, so he can change it for whatever he wants. Perush, but for him, lishanotah b'torah halva dav gamanat lifroa. But that's only to pay back. So he has 3 levels. An individual who gives it over to the tzedakah organization, what's he allowed to do? Nothing. Once the individual gives it to the tzedakah organization, it's done. Before he does, what's he allowed to do? But only as a loan. He's allowed to borrow against it. Right? So he's allowed to borrow, but that's only if he hasn't actually given it, he's just committed it. So basically, what he's saying is, look, I take a $5 bill, right? Very simple. Tell me this has never happened to you, okay? Yo-ho! You're going to Israel for the year. Please, can I give you money for tzedakah so you'll be my shliach mitzvah when you get to Israel? So you go, and 5 different people give you their special dollar bill folded up in like a little square, and you put it in your wallet. And then, pitom, shockingly, when you're going to Israel, the first thing in your mind is not the 5 people who gave you the folded up dollar bill that you now got to figure out how to give it to somebody at the hotel or something, or whatever they asked you to do. So what do? Right? You say, you know what? 5 people gave me $1. I will make sure to give $5 when I get to Israel on behalf of these 5 people. So what does he say? You're allowed to do that. Meaning, and now, when you take those $5 bills and you're sitting there at JFK, how'd you get here? JFK, and you realize you're hungry, so you want an overpriced whatever. You're more likely you're tired. You want an overpriced coffee, right, from Starbucks. So you just take the first $5, which is how much it'll cost you for a single shot of espresso or something. I have no idea what prices are at Starbucks these days. Definitely not the airport. I have no idea. You take those, and when you get to Israel, and if it happens to be that one of the dollars you used was the tzedakah dollars, when you get to Israel, you use a different one, right? So he says a yachid can do that. A yachid who's set aside money for tzedakah can borrow and just take different money because money is fungible, right? A what? What's that? Get there. The tzibor, he says, what are they allowed to do? Anything. And the gabbai can reallocate, but only to other charities, right? To other mitzvot, right? Those are the 3 levels. Let me just try to get through him, and then I'll take, this way I can just let my eyes rest and be done. So he says, "Uperish l'shanatev avad dafka amanat lefro adamrim v'ficha zutzaka v'yev sherlach zerbo v'afilu lo afrisha adayin." Right? He's not allowed to retract from his commitments. So perish ashri v'fi shita Rabbeinu Tam hayamash Omer Khan mikol makom eve'alva legabe tzibur l'ravcha demilta amar hachi. And this is the line that I found very fascinating. He says, the Hagot Ashri says that this is Rabbeinu Tam. And why did he call it a halva legabe tzibur? Right? Why did he call it a loan? What's the Ravcha de Milta? The Ravcha de Milta is basically, it doesn't mean anything. It's adding svaras, meaning that's not the ikr. The Ravcha de Milta, right? It's just like it adds an argument to something which is already true. Klomar shein hesed la'aniyim b'shinei zeh. All he meant to tell you is the poor are not going to lose out in the end of the day. Because one way or the other, the community has to take care of the poor. Okay? So I think, the reason I wanted you to read this is, first of all, he lays out the 3 positions, but I'm pretty sure that the way I read the Ran, as different from the Ramban, is the way he's reading it. Right? If he's saying, halva legabe tzibur, doesn't really mean that. It means a tzibur is allowed to reallocate resources. Period. End of story. Why? What does halva legabe tzibur mean for him? Let me just finish the thought. Simply that what? Right? The way we argued. That it's not really a loan for the Ran. It's that a community is allowed to reallocate resources because when necessary, they will add to the budget for the poor people. Right? That's how these umbrella organizations or the government works. Now, you guys want to ask about the gabbai. Why is the gabbai in this middle weird position? Adam, Ezra, Yoho, yeah? Yeah, I don't know if it was a great example, but it was fine. You made yourself shliach mitzvah money. I don't know. It's a good question whether you can do those. I assume you can, right? Because it's not like a communal fund, but I'm not sure. You might be right. Maybe you do have to leave the exact $5 to be the, I don't know. I have to think about it. I don't think you do, but I'm not sure. But you're right. You're like the gabbai in that sense. Yes, Ezra.
The obligation of this before after they had budgeted the money or whatever, like after they moved money
It doesn't sound like that. Right? It doesn't sound like that for the Ron, right? It doesn't sound like there's an increased responsibility to the poor. It just sounds like when they need it, if and when they need it, you will be there for them. And that's enough to justify this reallocation.
So if you're saying that, then it doesn't seem like there would be anything problematic in changing money because
correct. I agree. And I said that's probably the case, but I said it's possible. I said it's possible, right, that if, right, my feeling is what you said, is that what this means is that governments that function on budgets are allowed to reallocate. That's the yesod here. If you wanted to take it very literally and say, no, the poor people know that at the end of the day they have recourse by going back to the government, and that's why you're allowed to reallocate, because they know that in a year where there's an extra 1 million people out of work because of COVID, that you'll find a way to give them money, right? And that it's based on actual assumptions of what will happen. So maybe the administration changed from the Sanders to Thatcher government. So you'll never forget that, right? You might forget this entire sugya, but then the one thing you'll remember in 10 years is that I thought that Margaret Thatcher would rise from the dead and take over from a Bernie presidency. That's what you'll remember. It's terrible the way the human memory works, right? But if you read it narrowly, then you might care in such a circumstance. But if you read it expansively, that this is about the difference between tzedakah and government, or umbrella organizations, or budgets rather than charity per se, then yeah, it wouldn't matter even if you came up with that administration change. Yeah. Very good. So what Yoel picks up on, was many of you are trying to pick up on, is that the reason that you seem not to be allowed to change it in the case of real tzedakah is that when you collect it for the poor person per se, they own it already, which is not true in a budget case. Yes, 100%. Good. So So that's the question. So what's the difference of the gabbai? So one way is to say, let me ask you. So why is the gabbai in this middle position? So it could just be that, look, he's a middleman. So he represents the tzibur, but he isn't the tzibur. So he's entrusted to fulfill he has a certain amount of discretion, but a mid-level discretion, right? It's right? So it's possible that it's just a technicality, that he represents the tzibur and therefore has more flexibility than a yachid, but he isn't the tzibur, and therefore the trust we give him is in the middle. It could be, as Rami was very in favor of the Rush's argument, that maybe this is just a psychological argument, right? Is when we gave the money, what did we trust the tzibur to do? And the answer is, if you give it to the tzibur and it's overrun by it needs to be passed by the entire Congress, so then, I don't know if you trust Congress, but you assume that it will be reallocated however it's reallocated. But if it goes just to, a one particular bureaucrat, so we say, look, I don't want you checking with me every time you want to spend $1. You have a certain amount of discretion, but I don't want unlimited discretion because I trust you X and not Y. We're talking about the reallocation, right? Not bringing it to the tzibur, but now he's giving it out. Yeah, it sounds like that. Yeah. It sounds like it's only from you probably could go from reshut to mitzvah, but not.
Okay, and also why are you younger? If we're saying that the inspired concept here, we were actually owed money, and that's why you can reshut, then why is the youngest unable to
It's not. So that was the second half of the Chilul Hashem, is that based on the laws of Nidarim, right? Once the person's committed the money to stock, it's no longer his, right? That promise, that commitment is binding. So and that's why I think, right? See, that's why I think that the Ran and the Rabbeinu Tam are dafka not conceptualizing it as stuck-up, because you're right. What you're saying is the Ramban. The Ramban says that Tzibor and Yachid are basically the same. You can borrow and repay, right? That's exactly my point. The fact that the Ran and Rabbeinu Tam don't think you have to do that is because they're not conceptualizing social welfare as stuck-up, right? That's not the way a Tzibor functions, right? The Tzibor has to take care of certain things. They don't have commitments the same way. But remember, the accepted halacha of the Rush notes is that if the community doesn't take up a general fund, but actually holds a communal fundraiser for a particular poor person, then they are identical to the Yachid. It's a question of how they're functioning, right? In a case where the Tzibor is functioning like that, it is that way, right? So if the Tzibor runs a GoFundMe campaign, right, then you're right. So if, the city of whatever, what? Yeah. So I think it's just that it's, right, that staka implies a commitment to a particular type of either need or simply to need, right? Meaning budgets, government budgets don't function that way, right? We have a certain number of things we need to accomplish, but we don't commit money usually, unless we explicitly say we're doing that, right, to a particular person, to a particular cause, right? We commit ourselves to a host of causes, and the money has to be... But you have money that goes to each cause. Correct, but because that's how governments work, right? That's how budgets work, right? That in one year, we turns out there was a surplus in one and a deficit in the other, right? That's sort of just the way budgets are built. I think that's part of it, is that that's the way we conceptualize budgets, right? Is that, I think it's a practical thing that reveals a fundamental structural thing about the way government budgets work, is that you're not really raising money for this cause. You're raising money... So I don't know if it's practical. Meaning, Tzibor, look, it also happens to be that Tzibor has a different identity, right? It's a corporate identity, right? And therefore, it can think long term, right? Because it's beyond the people. The practical fundamental difference between Tzibor and Yachid is that Tzibor is I think part of it is that, right? Is that the Tzibor, because it's a corporate entity, everything about it functions differently. Yeah, I think that's, I didn't want to get bogged down in the difference between Tzibor and Yachid, because that's a shirin of its own right, which I love giving, and I have given, and it's a very complicated sugya, but I think part of it is that. Yeah, is that, okay. I'm going to try to take just 5 minutes now, okay, before we move on to the sugya. I held myself back from actually giving you basically a summary of all the other Shitot and Rishonim that is found just in the Torah and Beis Yosef. But as long as I have my Torah and Beis Yosef, and I'll read you a few more positions, let me just remind you how... Can you see my Torah? Yeah. Okay, so just a reminder so you know how things work, because it's always important. The middle text in a Torah is written by, this is the Torah, Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, the son of the Rosh, right? Then the main commentaries on the Torah are, on the inner column is the Beit Yosef. Who wrote that? Rabbi Yosef Karo, very good. The Bach is on the outside, which is Rabbi Yoel Circus, right? And then you have the Darkei Moshe, Rabbi Moshe Israel is over here, and then the, right, Prisha and Drisha from Rishon Falk. Okay, so there are a lot of different pshita that he brings here. I'm going to just, and you'll see that basically a lot of the positions quoted based they fit in different models that we talk about, but I just want you to see some of the ways these play out. So one of the things we've mentioned is that if a tzibur does do a specific fundraiser, then they are limited in the way a yachid is. So Rabbeinu Yonah, for example, says, let's say you did a high holiday fundraiser to only divvy up the money on fast days, right? So then you have to do that, right? Once the tzibur functions in that way, so then obviously you're bound by that, right? The Beis Yosef himself seems to think that the main reason that a tzibur is different is because of the Rush's reason that Rami was partial to, was that it's all about what did you intend. And right, he just feels that when a yachid gives money to the tzibur, he just feels like the tzibur is going to use it in whatever way is prudent. Okay. This distinction between Gabbai and Tzibur is nifsak lahalacha. It starts in the Ri. The Maharik says the reason that the Gabbai is allowed to move it for other mitzvahs is because when people give the money to the Gabbai, that's what they expect, basically. Okay? Here's a few other interesting points. The Rashba writes the following, and I want you to tell me how this fits in. The Rashba writes that Kol ma she'amru Rishon b'nei Ir, hainu dafka b'yamehem she'yu maspikim la'aniyin kol tzarcham. The only time that all these halachot apply is when the government used to collect enough money to actually take care of the poor. Aval achshav she'ein maspikim, ein lishanot mikol mako, ein lishanot. But now that the government doesn't collect enough money for the poor, you are not allowed to change at all. None of these halachot apply anymore. So, what does the Rashba think? Which model did the Rashba take? Spell it out for me.
It's really a issue that does go to the qualification that obviously, if everything, especially for example, are you can reallocate money for those things, but still take care of things with the qualify as like if you aren't able to take care of all the things before, then obviously if you reallocate funds to that, one of the things that you need to have a complete.
Good. So you could say this is a technicality, which is if you're not going to have enough money to reallocate to the poor, you can't do it, right? And you could justify this based on Rami's thing, which is it's based on intent, right? But I wonder whether the Rashba is our theoretical Bernie to Margaret Thatcher case, right? Where he thinks that community is different, not because it's like fundamentally different, but because you can actually trust the government to take care of the poor. But if that's not the reality, right, then it's not that the government is fundamentally different. It's practically different. But if it's not practically different than a tzibur, meaning by taking money away from the poor, they're not going to get it back, or the presidency is going to go from Bernie Sanders to Margaret Thatcher, and therefore by the end, they're not going to be taken care of, right? You can't, right, then you can't change, right? So I wonder if that's what he's saying, but the Beis Yosef notes that the Rabbeinu Meir, meaning the Maharam Württemberg, is quoted in the Mordechai as saying that it's not true, right? No, a tzibur can always reallocate resources unless, again, they raise it for a particular poor person, etc. The last case that I wanted to mention is okay. This was something that people asked me, and that's why I wanted to bring up this last one. Okay, here's a case of Maharik. And you tell me, right, someone asked me a question like this. I don't remember who it was, though. Gabay tzedakah shenitparda chavila v'halchu kulam chutz la'ir. Okay, this is the case. The Gabay tzedakah collected money, and then what happened? The city disbanded. The city disbanded, meaning it just stopped being a city, right? Everyone moved out, and I don't know what happened, right? Global warming led to, right, that city floating away into the ocean because the tides rose and everybody just left, right? I don't know, right? Come up with whatever you want. What? What did you say? Yes, exactly, right. After, yes, the government, Israel couldn't get their act together. Everyone just gave up because Knesset never formed. They just moved out. Forget it. We're moving out. We're done. Fine. Whatever. I don't know. It was, it was after disengagement, and the city literally doesn't exist anymore, right? Whatever. This happens. It's not like it happens all the time, but it happens, right? It was 1492. And they were expelled from Spain. They had just done a successful fundraising campaign before they knew they'd have to leave the country. I don't know, right? Come up with whatever case you want, right? It was whatever, the expulsion of the Jews from England or the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, from Portugal. It's happened enough times. This happens. Fine. Now the Gabbai said, but wait a second. We just held a successful fundraiser. I have $20 million I need to allocate, right? I'm being very optimistic here, right? I don't know how optimistic it is if I'm saying that in the same breath as the Spanish expulsion, but fine. It was Anatevka, yes. Are you going to sing for us? Chaval. That would have warmed my heart. Yeah. It's a good scene. I mean, sad scene, but it's a good scene. Classic. The movie and the play. I did. I saw it on Broadway a long time ago. I've seen it actually twice. I saw it on Broadway and off Broadway. My parents are very into theater, so growing up we saw a lot of theater. We went to plays on like an average of once a month, So, but this one I did see on Broadway. What, Ezra? Okay, fine. So what do you think? What is the Gabbai to do? What are you supposed to do? Right? What do you do? The city no longer exists. What do you do with the money? That is definitely not the answer. Who? What? Where? Good. So I love how, basically every possibility has been raised. So here's what the Marik actually says, but you could see how they would call it. So this is what the Marik actually writes. He says, Im Gabbai nitzman me ratzon akal lechalik tzaka ledato v'al emunuto hayustom chim gam there should be liado la'asot mehem kertzono. First possibility is Rami. He says if the money was given to him and everyone understood that they just trust him and they can do whatever they want, so then based on just their psychological assumption, what do we let them do? You can do whatever you want, meaning we trust you. Possibility one. But what if he was not given authority? He was just a technocrat, right? And we just trusted him to divide it up as we saw fit. But the policies were made by the budgetary committee, not by him. So then what does he have to do? Right? They only said you can watch the money, you can take care of it. But the city was in charge of allocating it. So then what does he have to do? So possibility one. If he can find the people who used to be the head of the city before the city stopped existing, then he can ask them. O ruba maskemet, right? To either give it to tzedakah, Talmud Torah, Yisomim, v'im lo yaskimu. But what happens if he finds the old government, but none of them agree? Now what does he do? Yasim agaba mashiyirtze. He should do whatever he wants with them. Rak shirtzim b'acham and mitzvah niskar, as long as he uses it for a reasonable mitzvah. V'im efshar limalech b'hem me'ez etam sheyeh. And if he can't consult with them, then do the best you can, right? So you see that there are these multiple layers, right? The multiple possibilities, I think you can all figure out how this plays into some of the models that we saw. Yes, Yoho, you get the last word.
You're saying that the money, like the